Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Research Forum. We're so glad that you are here today. We have a packed schedule today. We have three and received her MSc in epidemiology from Queen's University in Canada before coming to UNC to complete her doctoral training in epidemiology. She started here at Duke as a postdoc in the Center for Population Health Sciences and started on faculty, is now faculty in the Department of Population Health Sciences and has primarily focused on evaluating medication safety and effectiveness in adult and pediatric populations, as well as utility and fitness for use of EHR data in clinical research, which is going to be the focus of our talk today. You'll also be hearing a little bit from me. I've worked on a small qualitative piece of this project that I'm excited to tell you about, focused primarily on clinical trial recruitment. And then I will be joined by one of our operational leaders in MegaTrials, Ty Rorick, for discussion at the end. So without further ado, I will pass it over to Dr. Brad Hammill.
All right, great, thank you, Emily. We're here today to talk about some work we're doing with a global MegaTrial. It's an ancillary study leveraging electronic health record data. I want to go ahead and flip to the next slide because there's some audience participation here today. Oh, I'm going to do that, that's right. All right, so we're going to have 3 of these today, so if you have your phone, while I introduce what we're going to talk about, go ahead and answer this question. You have to enter the code up the top, and apparently it all just works like magic. So respond, agree, strongly agree to strongly disagree to this statement. The EHR will one day replace the case report form as the primary source of data in clinical trials. So while you do that, I'll tell you, we're not necessarily here today to kind of talk about the benefits or limitations of EHR data per se. That really underlies all the work that we're doing, and I feel like that's been covered in a number of forums before. What we really want to talk about is like our operational experience on this actual global MegaTrial and how the plans that we had actually had to change and adapt as we've been going along here, because this is kind of uncharted territory, not only for DCRI, but for, I think, a lot of people. So one of the themes that we'll have today is kind of planned versus reality, and at the end, we'll sum up just a few of our learnings with that kind of frame. And hopefully also help people understand that, you know, we can kind of help teach people how to do this going forward, because this is a place DCRI, of course, is naturally going to go. So here's some interesting results. I'm actually really encouraged not to see strongly disagree on the right. I expected this maybe to be like bimodal with a bunch of naysayers and a bunch of positive folks, but some would agree. That's great. That seems more positive than not, so let's pave that road forward. Thanks so much. And get ready for the other 2 when they come up. So the electronic health record is already being used in clinical research, especially within clinical research trials. Here are some of the things that may or may not already being done on trials. You might be using the EHR to do some feasibility analysis. How many patients are at this site? Do we have the right type of patients? Is this a big enough population to use for this trial or even proposing a trial? If I want to identify a cohort really specifically, I might want to look at my EHR data. Certainly for recruitment, want to figure out when that patient might be coming in so that we can make sure to intercept them when they show up. Of course, you know, clinical nurses are using this for medical history ascertainment of patients who are in trials right now, and the same thing for endpoint ascertainment. So some of that isn't necessarily new. What we're doing in the trial that I'll describe to you today is doing a lot of this, well, at least the last two pieces there, in a lot more of an automated way so that we don't have to rely on somebody to translate, like the EHR information, looking it up and then typing it into a parallel system specifically for the trial. So we're talking a little bit here about that kind of automation of electronic health record data within clinical research. So the future is definitely the next exit, but I will say right now it's kind of a road that we're building as we're on it, which is real a source of interest and challenge. So we are working on it, and hopefully you'll kind of get a sense of that today. In fact, I should probably also say that we're not even talking very much, except for Emily's piece, about results, because a lot of the data that we'll be gathering for this trial won't even be kind of happening until next year at the earliest. So we're actually talking a little bit here now about what we've learned so far just recruiting sites to this effort. So the Harmony Outcomes trial is a GlaxoSmithKline trial. They've got albiglutide, which is just part of the diabetes kind of glucose-lowering therapies. This trial is really a safety trial. They were looking at major cardiovascular events. Over 9,000 subjects across 28 countries, more than 600 sites. It is an event-driven trial, which means we didn't have a hard end date for when this trial would stop. That becomes relevant in a few slides, just so you know. We didn't actually know when this thing was going to end. So on top of that, this is where the DCRI gets involved. We proposed this EHR ancillary study. So the guiding principle, if I could put it that way, would basically be to indicate that we know the EHR is rich clinical data. And we're certainly using it in kind of health services research already. But is it fit for use in high quality clinical trial research? We're not quite sure. I think that evidence base is a little bit unwritten at this point. And so since it's not been rigorously evaluated, this is kind of just another brick in the wall to see, does it work? How does it work? Where are the shortcomings? Where are the strengths? We're really two of the goals, and then on the next slide we'll have the actual kind of research objectives. We really want to understand, how can these EHR data be efficiently used, reliably used. Again, if we can eliminate this parallel kind of data entry, then we might be able to save some costs, reduce personnel, and really transform trial conduct. So that's kind of the big picture here. I copy this New England Journal sounding board piece that Dr. Califf was a first author on, just to indicate that this is on the radar of the FDA as well. We actually did get funding for this project from the FDA in addition to Glaxo, because they are very much interested in figuring out how to use source EHR data for at least late phase clinical trial work. So here's our kind of first planned. On the next slide, it'll be kind of more what's actually happening. So these were the three objectives that were proposed at the start of it. Objective 1, I'd like to understand how EHR data are used to facilitate trial recruitment, and then understand some barriers to that. Objective 2, to evaluate the fitness of EHR data for populating baseline characteristics in the ECRF. And again, that's kind of in an automated way, not necessarily just like looking stuff up. And then objective 3, explore the use of EHR data to find events of interest during trial follow-up. The whole idea here, in a way, was that globally, we were going to ask sites to make essentially a database from their EHR data that we would then query directly. I'll talk a little bit more about that when I talk about that strategy in particular. But it was going to be a very unified strategy here. All sites across the world were going to do the same thing. We were going to send the same SaaS program to everybody and get this data back in one place, and it's all going to be extremely cohesive. It didn't end up turning in that way. I don't really necessarily want to talk about the whys for that. It's just that it was challenging to get a lot of different countries on board, and Sudha might talk to some of that. But one of the first things that happened is that Glaxo said, you know what, we actually don't want this ancillary study to impact the course of the main trial at all. We don't want you finding events that they might or might not have to include, especially if it's kind of after the fact and we have to go investigate things. They just wanted the main trial to be the main trial. So objective 3, instead of being, let's look for events as the trial goes on and kind of send these reports back to the sites that are participating, it actually was rewritten to be more like Objective 2, which is to evaluate the fitness of use of EHR data for identifying clinical endpoints. And the reason for that is now it's more retrospective. We can do all of this work after the fact. And this is where the fact that it was an event-driven trial kind of became interesting, because we were talking to sites a year or two ago and had just learned that Glaxo didn't want us to do anything for this during the course of the trial. And so we said, great, we need to get you on board and then hold on for a few years, which is pretty challenging. Objective 1 turned into basically a site survey to really understand what some of these recruitment uses and barriers were. That's what Emily will talk about. Objectives 2 and 3 were kind of mashed together, since now they're really parallel, and split into the data Mart strategy, which is exactly what I described before, which was conceived to be this plan from the beginning, and then the national strategy, which is what Sudha will talk about. And that's where we partner with kind of big national databases to answer these questions as well. So I will, here's a question, and I'm going to pass it over to Emily. The question is, I've worked on a study that used the EHR to identify potential participants. So if you've got your phone up, it should pop right up. Great, thanks.
Great. So thanks, Brad, so much for that fantastic overview. And while folks are answering this on Menti, I do want to say that this is a really interesting and fun experience for me. So much of my training and work so far has been focused on having a really large data set that would support all kinds of observational analyses. And so this was very much a shift towards thinking, well, how do we even get patients into the trial to begin with, and sort of what does that process look like, and how does the EHR facilitate, or how does it act as a barrier to that process? So let's see. No votes yet, I guess. Might be that. Well, how about we do show of hands? How many people have used the EHR in the past to identify potential trial? Okay, good. So for those of you who've used it, you understand it's not as simple as having a clean set of parameters for inclusion and exclusion in a clinical trial protocol, and then having clinical data that you can sort of easily match up and just find people who are eligible and recruit those people. There are a lot more nuances to it, and that was really what we were hoping to characterize through some of the work that we did with Objective 1. So these are some of the general questions that were sort of guiding the survey development, the focus group development, the results of which I'll show you in just a moment. Really interested in sort of general perspectives on the enrollment workflow. So for study coordinators, you're assigned to a trial and you need to recruit patients for that trial. Where do you start, and how does the EHR fit into that process? And then a couple of additional ancillary factors that we'd heard from our operational team members here were important, like the pre-screening process that sort of dictates what criteria are used in the query of the EHR and how that affects the number of patients that come out of that search. But really the guiding concept was this funnel shown here on the left. For any of you who've worked with structuring an EHR query, you know that often you end up with a very large number of possible participants. And we also know that the number of participants per site that end up enrolling in a trial is very, very small. So we really thought that this would be an interesting opportunity to characterize that narrowing, what we refer to as that narrowing process. So what are the factors that prohibit a larger number of patients that seem eligible from an EHR perspective from actually enrolling in the trial? So we use a mixed methods approach to this. The first step was a series of focus groups, about an hour and a half long. We targeted about 15 to 20 site coordinators, and really just wanted to hear about their experiences as study coordinators, how they use the EHR. There wasn't a whole lot in the literature about how to correctly ask study coordinators or appropriately ask them about their experiences using the EHR. So we were really looking for some sort of broad information before we went to the second step, which was development of this online survey and funnel measure. That has just closed, and we are just getting to the point of data cleaning and analysis of those data. So we hope to present those results at some point in the future, but for now, we'll just present the focus group results. So unfortunately, actually another reason that we're very excited about the larger survey is that our focus group participants were largely limited to the United States, about 14 study coordinators from the US. We had one from Canada, 2 from the UK, and 1 from Denmark. So certainly the focus group findings have to be interpreted with the caveat that it's primarily US sites and that there may be variation when you go outside of the US. But essentially what we found is that most sites reported that using study-specific EHR queries was the highest yield method for identifying potential participants. And that there was certainly an evolution from past sort of more traditional methods shown here, like advertising campaigns on local radio stations, online message boards, connecting with patient education classes. Those were still being used, but they were being used largely in conjunction with the EHR searches. We also know that not all EHR searches are the same in that they sometimes fit into the workflow differently depending on the study coordinator, depending on the site. What we found is that most of the study coordinators reported that they used one of 2 methods. The first method being a review of upcoming clinic visit schedules and then sort of cross-checking that list with the EHR to identify any obvious exclusion criteria and then to flag potentially eligible patients from recruitment, for recruitment. So sort of starting with who's going to be coming to clinic and then working from there. And then the second method was doing the EHR search to start and then comparing that list with medical records to identify any major inclusion or exclusion issues and then to flag potentially eligible patients with upcoming visits for recruitment. So we're really interested in this concept of barriers. So again, acknowledging that the funnel at the top is very different from the population that we end up with for the trial. So what are the barriers to getting better use of the EHR and identifying a more appropriate study population at the start? Several sites reported that they didn't have access to reporting or research modules that could be used more effectively to identify potential participants. Some of them reported that they were required to wait for patients to respond so they could identify a set of patients, send out information about the study, but they couldn't follow up via phone. They didn't have permission to do that. Some were restricted in terms of accessing the EHR without patient consent, and then some restrictions on cold calling patients about a study without their consent as well. So we sort of collated this into a couple of response options that seem to sort of bubble to the top as the most important contributors to that narrowing process. And these are the ones that we queried in our quantitative survey and the results that we'll be analyzing and looking at over the coming months. But essentially we found that most sites said that important factors contributing to the narrowing included the patient being cared for by another provider, so showing up in the search, but you don't have access to that patient because they're someone else's patient. Not all trial criteria are easily translatable into an electronic health record query. The informaticists in the room are smiling because that gives them headaches every day. Patients that often, especially for method 2, where they started with the broad EHR search and then tried to identify patients with an upcoming visit, that was responsible for a lot of the narrowing, sort of provider perception of whether the patient was eligible for the trial, and then patient refusal. So again, hope to have some good data, even if it's not perfectly representative of all studies and all sites, but hopefully a little bit more quantitative in terms of the major contributors to this process. So with that, I will turn it over to Brad Hammill, who will tell us about the data Mart work.
Great, I'm back. I'm going to try and keep this a little bit quick so that there's plenty of time for Sudha, and so that we have plenty of time to discuss this and have get questions if it's not clear. So the data Mart strategy it ended up being just a select U.S. site-based strategy. The original plan was probably for about a dozen sites with a few hundred participants. We're in final contract stages now. We hope to have maybe 10, and it'll be a little less than 200 patients there. For folks who have been to some of the PCORnet-related research conferences here in the last year or so, the model for this ancillary study is actually very similar to PCORnet, where the general idea is we're asking all these sites to transform their data into a common format so that we can send the same program to each of the sites and gather the information that we need. The idea here is that I don't necessarily want, especially for a trial that might have follow-up lasting 2 or 3 years, I don't necessarily want like every single diagnosis code in those 3 years coming back to Duke. we're able to write a query that summarizes the information that we need, the relevant information from all these sites, and send back just this kind of a little more summary information to us. Similarly, they might have just dozens and dozens and dozens of lab values, lab results over a 2 or 3 year follow-up period. We don't necessarily want all those. Maybe we want to look for one in a very specific time window, or we're only interested at the end of the trial. So the idea is that we don't want every single piece of their kind of like a data dump from their electronic health record. We want the ability to query whichever pieces we want, and in order to do that, we need them to put the data into a specific format. So again, we're using this data mart strategy to evaluate baseline characteristics and endpoints from coded data. Now that little blue arrow, of course, in the middle there between the simple idea of an EHR and this EHR sub-study data set is a lot of really important, huge pieces. And so I just wanted to make sure people knew, like, there's a lot of work here, some of which just happens, but some of which is really specific to this type of work that ends up being the thing that was like a stumbling block for a number of the sites. So of course, the EHR is just information entered during routine healthcare delivery. That happens. What really helps us is when we find sites who have some sort of data warehouse that gets routinely refreshed. Maybe they do it for quality reporting. Maybe they do some internal research. This is something that's not unusual to a place like Duke or a place like UNC or other research or large hospitals. But it is a little unusual for smaller groups, especially folks who might just be a primary care practice. This is not something they probably have a lot of personnel for. So if you don't have that internal data warehouse and you try and jump right to the third step, which is transform your data into this common format that we're going to define for you, it means you have to go back to this raw EHR database that's disparate in a lot of different places and figure out what to grab and how to put it in a certain place. The fact that a site might have a data warehouse in between these things means they've already started that process, and they have personnel for doing that process. So that second box is really critical. The third box is a lot of the work that we're asking them to do. And again, as I noted before, they store that data in a data mart and then allow us access to that data mart through a distributed like SAS program or SQL program. When looking for sites, as I note, we really want to see that they have a data warehouse that, like I just described. We really need to know that they have some technical staff there. Again, there are certain sites where this is really obvious. A place like Duke, we're very lucky to have the wealth of kind of technical staff that we do. And this would not be a big lift for them. It's a lot of work, but it's not like a question about who might do the work. That's not true with all sites. We ran into multiple small clinical trial, almost specific research sites who just don't have that person on site, if at all. Those sites also tended not to have the data that we needed. They had the ability to query hospital data, but they didn't necessarily get a live stream of all the information about that hospitalization that they could just dump into a database. They might get lab values back on a fax machine and then put that PDF into the medical record, and I wish I was kidding, but that makes it very difficult to extract and put it into a database for us to access. So there were a few things that really knocked out a lot of sites immediately. And then again, it really helps if there's all the folks here, both the clinical and the operational and the technical, know who each other are. One site outsourced their EHR data because they're a small site, and so they contract with this other group. We're still working through a contract with them, but it's a lot more difficult because they're so removed and have very specific roles and tasks. We're often talking to the clinical people, and they need to help us figure out who the technical people are. And so that sometimes they don't even know who's who. So it's been an interesting process, and that's why from however many sites there are in the U.S., getting 10 has been a real challenge. It is kind of like that, yeah. And that's pretty much the data mart strategy. That is different from what Sudha's about to describe a little bit, which is the national strategy.
All right. So the national strategy has the same overall objectives. We're still looking to compare the baseline characteristics and the clinical trial outcomes to that we can find in an EHR system, except this time we're looking, instead of site systems, we're looking at national data sets that already exist that collate this routinely collected data into these big national resources that have already been used for research. So what we're doing is here in this diagram, the blue square representing the national data set, sort of getting all the information from across each selected country. And what we plan is to partner with these academic collaborators who use the data to get those baseline characteristics about the patients who have been consented in the Harmony trial, and then put it in a format that we can understand and send to us for comparison to the trial data and between the other countries as well. So the figure sort of belies a little bit of a more complicated process. The first step was to decide of all the countries participating in the main Harmony trial, which would be the best countries to try this strategy out in. Oh, of course, the green arrow is really important. You can't look in the national data set without figuring out who the patients are. In a clinical trial, it's not the operation to find out to identify the patients in the trial. It is a key priority to not identify the patients in the trial. So what we needed was a method to get that information from a site who does know the identity of the patients in the trial to the academic collaborator who could then request only that data from the national data set. And so I suppose proposed was the original figure, and then the updated figure has this big green arrow that we've had to figure out. So the main activity that we've been doing over the past year and a bit has been figuring out who are the countries and the national partners that we're going to be working with. And so we've assembled a list of criteria that were crucial to figuring out whether this was implementable in the country or not. So we looked at 9 different countries, and I'll go through the different criteria one by one. So first, the national data set has to have the trial outcomes. And that seems to be a given. And we were looking not only for the trial outcomes, but also the baseline characteristics. So having that patient history over time was important to have. Not only did we need to have the data, but we needed to be able to access that data in a timely way. So that we call data latency. So what is the time period from the event occurring to when that data is available for us to use and access for research purposes? And for the countries that we looked at, that ranged anywhere from 3 to 4 months to 2 to 3 years. And so at some point we had to figure out where on that continuum would be too long to wait. What was also interesting is that it depended on the type of outcome that you're looking for. For example, death, the fact of death, was actually very quickly updated in a lot of systems because insurance systems or countries like to know who's in their population, who's not. What took a lot longer is the cause of death. So that is figuring out what the actual cause of from various different data sort of streams. That final decision of what the cause of death is, there wasn't a country that was able to do that in less than 12 to 18 months. So that's something that we've learned as we've gone through. The national partner and the country in which we're looking at that national data set has to be able to cover either almost 100% of the population or a defined section of the country. And that's because we have to find out, of the trial participants in that country, how many do we expect to find in the national data set. And so for the countries that don't have almost 100% coverage, some examples are here, the reasons were varied why that was. Either in England, it could be the data source. The hospitalizations are more complete. They have a data set that looks at 100% of the hospitalizations in the UK as compared to their primary care data set, used for research all the time, but really looks at a smaller proportion of the population. In the US Medicare, that division was made by age. The majority of over 65-year-olds are covered by Medicare. And in the Netherlands, it was by region. Those in a certain area of the country were covered by the data set that what we would have access to. So key to understanding the contents of that finder file, that identifiable information that allows us to say this Harmony patient consents to their data being pulled from the national data set, we needed some common person-level identifier that we could use to enact the ancillary study, the national strategy. In England and Scotland, all the countries had something that could serve this purpose. the question that came as we discussed with the countries was, how are we able to access, who was able to access that piece of information, who was able to, how are we able to send it, who can store it, how long can we use it for? All those questions are things that, beyond the presence of a common person identifier, we are looking at currently. And the last main criteria, which is crucial, is the actual national partner. The national partner in the people that we were speaking to were academic researchers who were well-versed in using the national data sets for comparative effectiveness research, epidemiological studies, observational research. What they did know was their health system, how they used that data to define the clinical concepts that we wanted to measure. And so they really understood what the implications are of all those idiosyncrasies of those data, and the implications on the quality of the data that we'd be asking them to send to us. In many countries, access to the data is actually limited to researchers within the country. So it was imperative for us to have a national partner from the country. And similar to that, they were also very familiar and helped us wade through the many ethical and regulatory applications that needed to be submitted to make sure that we could access the data in a way that satisfied sort of all the stakeholders. So putting all those criteria on balance, we assessed 9 countries, as I mentioned, and we've decided to move forward in 5 countries. And I have them in 4 squares because we are planning to have 4 different national partners. And the main data set that we'll be using in Sweden, Denmark, USA, and Scotland, England, are their hospitalization data sets with contributions from other data sets as well. And there are several countries that, for various reasons, there wasn't necessarily one major deal breaker in each of the countries that we deemed not feasible. And I can go into some of the details if you're interested, but it was a sort of a holistic assessment that we needed to do with some of the countries, both to deem it feasible as well as to deem it infeasible. So similar to the national strategy, the little blue arrow expands into a multitude of tasks. And we're working through some of the first 2 right now as we move forward with implementing the contracts with the 4 national partners. The regulatory and ethical approvals obviously we're starting de novo from them. So even though we're linking it to the ongoing main trial, figuring out who to apply to and how to describe our study in the appropriate way has been a challenge in each of the different countries. We're presently figuring out with the sites what is the best way to collect the finder file. So we're asking sites who are used to a clinical trial mechanism to do something very different. Collect data that they may not have access to, or they may have access to, but not electronically. So we don't actually want them to be typing 9 numbers into an Excel form. But we have to figure out the process that would be suitable and sort of that fit the guidelines of how we want this trial to, or the ancillary study to occur. Once that's done and the finder file goes to the national partner will then, after the end of the trial and after the data has become available, link the study patients with their national data, transform that into study or clinical characteristics that we would like, relatively, like Brad said, relatively simple concepts that we can compare to the trial outcomes and baseline characteristics. And once they've done that, they make sure that the de-identified, though person-level de-identified data will come back to DCRI for comparison to the trial data as well as comparison between the countries. So this is our early learnings, our main early learnings. And I might actually invite Emily and Brad to come up here because we realize that each of these early learnings has an example perhaps in each of these.
Go over there. Go over there.
Go over here.
Yeah. That was not working.
All right.
So we haven't really figured out how we're going to do this slide yet, so bear with us. All right, so just let's go to the first one.
All right.
Oh, I'll take this one?
Okay.
Yeah. So one of the interesting things I believe about kind of the team who's working on this ancillary study is it primarily started with the pragmatic health systems research folks, right? And this is a group that's decidedly not the trials group. And so we've done a lot of observational research and are very familiar with this type of data. But when we were putting together the protocol for the ancillary study, we're almost, I don't want to use the phrase making it up, but I have to, right? Because because we're just, they're like, oh, you need a protocol? Here, we're going to do a protocol. Oh, you need a data management plan? Great, here's a data management plan. And it wasn't, we didn't know ahead of time a lot of the things that they were asking for, and that's why in the proposed it was kind of like, hey, here's what we're going to do. It sounds good, right? And then the actual study is, we're dealing with the real clinical trial folks at Glaxo, and they have a lot of requirements and some real standards that we're just not used to necessarily meeting. And I think it's a good thing that we're actually being pushed to meet that, because if this is going to be a process that health record, EHR data is going to be used for clinical research, we need to raise our standards somewhere higher maybe than where we were, and I don't know if we need to necessarily be all the way at the top of the clinical trial standards that are, we'll have to, can we negotiate on that? Because it's been very complex, and I feel like there's been it's just taken a lot of time just to meet some of these administrative requirements. Is that fair?
Yeah.
Okay.
John has a quick comment.
Yeah.
I hope you're pushing back, because I think that we in the clinical trials world have this assumption that everything we do is well thought out and rational and has a good justification. And a lot of these standards create barriers to novel approaches like this, and not all of them are necessarily justified. And so I do think that negotiation is a good term for thinking through what are the best practices for doing clinical trials for eventually, hopefully, registrational purposes using these kinds of techniques. And our current SOPs may not be. And we may need to do some rethinking of our SOPs in terms of those.
That's a great point. And I would just, if I could highlight the adaptable study as well, which is another one that's based on top of PCORNet using electronic health record data. I think one of the most interesting negotiations happening right now is the DSMB negotiation, because they have just expectations based on prior work with trials about what they'd like to see, and we literally can't give them what they want to see. And so we're working on their expectations, and it's important to really do that and make sure that they understand that we're doing the best we can.
Right, and do you need that? I mean,
and how much is needed.
Right, are these expectations because of what you've done previously, or are these expectations because this is what you need? And
That's a great question. Yeah, that's a great point. Thanks, John.
We usually have Leslie handle those conversations.
There's definitely some pushback. Don't worry.
I think we have maybe Chris Granger real quick, and then.
This in context of some of the other work that's been done, because this isn't, and you've started, you've alluded to that somewhat, but like Mark Latke did this study looking at Medicare claims versus clinical trial outcomes and treatment effect, and certainly the Swedes, as you know, partly from working with them, have used the Swedish National Registry now in a couple of big trials of thousands of patients as a key EHR approach to doing large clinical trials. So there's a lot of work going on in the field, and I know there's been some interaction, but could you comment on that?
I might. I definitely, when looking to start figuring out how to do this in various countries, I looked at examples of how they had completed it, and I would say that though it's been happening in individual countries, I believe I haven't seen an example of where it's occurring across countries. And though the technical, this kind of leads into the next learning, is though the technical requirements of doing the study are not really, really high, it is high to try to harmonize those across. That's very nice. Harmonize them across the various countries. So looking to WASCOPS did this sort of record linkage to extend follow-up of a clinical trial over 5, 10, and 20 years. We know it can be done, but the question is, can we do that across multiple countries? And I think, given that's the way that many trials run, that's still a question that we haven't yet found the answer.
And I would say with the data mart strategy in the US, this hasn't been done as much in this country as it has in other national databases in other countries. And so I think we are trying to kind of plot a way forward here. And we'll see how much this, kind of the structure of how we're doing it might help. It's funny because we're asking these sites to do a lot of the work that PCORNet sites have taken years to do. But if we can argue in a way that other people might be able to leverage that infrastructure in the future, maybe it'll make more sense for folks. Good question.
Okay.
Next one. Is that you?
It could be me.
Go for it.
I'll go for it. Okay, so the data link, I think I alluded to this earlier, that the technical requirements of linking data is relatively straightforward. We need some sort of way to identify the patients who have consented in the Harmony trial and identify them in the national data set. And to do that, we have this common person-level ID. The diagram is relatively straightforward, but what we realize is that the governance processes, the approvals that we need are multifaceted. So from the level of the site, they need to check with their information security that they can move personal identifiers around. We need to check with the national partners, university, and their requirements about how they hold research data. Then each region or country has its own ethical approvals, and then we have to layer just the processes of the clinical trial in which this whole study has taken place. So I feel that that governance and that whole process of how do we actually do the linkage is much more complicated than actually doing the linkage once we have two sets of data that are ready to be linked. I don't know, did that cover everything?
Yeah, that's good. Okay.
We can do this.
Here, you?
Yeah.
Yeah.
maybe.
Oh, maybe. Okay, no.
I don't know. I could do another one too.
No, we're just, again, making it up. With the proposed study, we really assumed that, hey, EHR data, that's real time, baby. Like, that is available and not a big deal, and the trick is really making everybody have the same information in the same format so that we know what we're dealing with. And at least with the national data, but it is true a little bit with even kind of large system EHRs, is the timeliness is actually a lot less good than we maybe thought it was. And especially for national partners, as I think Sudha highlighted, that sometimes those data sets can be years delayed. And that, if you're trying to do any sort of like timely clinical research, is kind of a deal breaker. So I think we learned a little bit about that. Format, yeah, getting the data into a common format, I think it's technical work, it's hard work, it needs to be done, but it's less of a hurdle than, for at least some places, this timeliness aspect.
And then also in the national strategy, the national partners have been using those administrative databases to define these clinical concepts for years, and they're actually already using ICD-10 codes, so they have these algorithms, some of them already validated for some of the trial outcomes. And so in fact, that kind of like getting it into the format that we need is not really as big a lift for them as perhaps we may have thought.
Well, and I would say that, just to add to the timeliness issue, this is, I think, really highlighted that the answer to our EHR data fit for use is it really a multi-dimensional kind of answer, right? So for something like trial monitoring, where you're really concerned about looking at robust safety estimates, it's, obviously the year's delay doesn't work. For observational analyses, the timeliness may not be as big of an issue. So we knew the answer was multifaceted, but we've seen how that works in practice.
So the proposed ancillary study consent form, there was actually language in the original consent form that patients were presented with that alluded to the use of EHR data to get outcomes and compare, and that was so part of the main trial. And as we further developed the national strategy and the data mart strategy, what we realized is that we needed more meat to providing to consenting patients, and what needed to happen was that patients needed to be presented with a separate sort of additional consent that dealt with the ancillary study in addition to the main trial. And so that Adding another consent, we discovered there's a process of reconsenting. We're trying to figure out if we can time that with some reconsenting that may need to happen in the trial already. And then, so I think, and then as we come to the end of the trial, the consent needs to happen when the patients actually are there and available. So even though our activities are taking place for the most part after the end of the trial, we need to get that consent in front of patients before the last time we see them. And so that's added a little bit of complexity in terms of sort of the pace at which we have to figure this out, what would be appropriate, and sort of trying to pull out all stops to get as many patients consented. Essentially, we have a captive audience. If we don't get as many patients as we can't recruit more to come into the ancillary study. So it's really important for us to try to work with these challenges, and yeah, a little bit different from what we originally proposed.
Okay, so now we're going to move to Q&A. We have
we
three
have
of us
that.
in. Oh, do we have more?
We have.
No, we have one.
Oh, we have a
question.
minute. Okay,
Yeah,
great.
so while we're
we're
getting
getting
the
set
chairs.
up.
Yes, for Q&A. This is the question for everyone. So if you were going to use EHR for data collection in a global mega trial, what would be the issue that would keep you up at night? Would it be, oh, here we go, the technical challenges of linkage, this is a little bit small on the bottom, data governance, the lag time or data availability, consent issues, or you would just not try to use EHR for this purpose at all? So I would love to see how the histogram moves on this one.
It looks like it's not open.
It's not open.
Oh, do I have to do something?
We're just going to let that do its thing.
Yeah,
Yeah.
okay. So we'll open it up for audience questions. And actually, maybe I'll kick us off because we have someone with extremely deep and robust experience in megatrials who's joining us. And we've heard some of your experience and how different this is from a traditional conduct of a traditional clinical trial along the way, and you've been very supportive to the team. But I'm curious if you can sort of describe how you see this sort of fitting into the conduct of a more traditional mega trial, and if you're a believer or if you would never try to use the EHR for this purpose.
I would never try to use it. No, is this on? Yeah.
Yeah.
By the way, I'm Ty Rorick. I work in MegaTrials and had the fortune of working with these fine folks on the Harmony ancillary trial going back several years, and I'm also involved in the adaptable study, so I get to see sort of both sides of how we're trying to utilize the EHR in big trials. To answer Emily's question, I think while I think the biggest challenge is when we ask sites, like, do you have an EHR, do you use your EHR, they always say yes. They say, sure, yep, I use it all the time. I think where we find the biggest issue is sort of the links to what these guys have talked about, is how do they link that information that they get to actual people in their institutions that know how to get that information and then use it to something that actually makes their work a little bit more efficient. So I think that the jury remains out on whether or not how this can actually be utilized in a large-scale mega trial, and I'd say in a broader, more efficient way for everyone. I think sites believe they can use it in some way, and I think we need to continue to find ways to help them sort of distill the information, because there is a wealth of information that's available, but how they distill that into something that's actually usable for them.
Dr. Curtis.
Yeah, no, this was great. I have a question actually for Ty, and then I'd like one of you to answer it as well. As we've gone along in this process, thinking back to what you expected when it started, what has been the biggest surprise or learning for you? And then I would ask some of the ancillary study team to comment as well.
Yeah, I think probably the biggest surprise was, and it probably shouldn't have been, when I look back on it, because I remember being in Scotland with you when we initially met with some of the folks from GSK and the Scottish folks, but I think that the biggest surprise was probably the apprehension, maybe, of the sponsor. The reason they came to DCR to be involved in Harmony in the first place was for the EHR ancillary study, and it actually led to more work for us in doing some site management work in the US. But I think their apprehension, and then with any big global pharma company, there's lots of turnover. There's the infrastructure within their organization that evolved over time. So I think the biggest surprise, but like I said, it shouldn't be a surprise, is that we had to rework things over and over and over again with a multitude of different people, always having to sort of go back to the beginning of why we were even doing this.
And I would I think just real briefly say the culture clash, just between our group and the rigidity of the trials group, as we've kind of alluded to before, was more surprising to me than, it wasn't unexpected, but the degree to which it kind of showed up, I think, was really surprising.
John?
So, Ty, when I think about this, I think that our EHR processes still all this data go to a person, a core research coordinator, who then does things manually and reconnects it to the trial team. And you guys have talked about how to take, as I listen to it, data from the database, get it directly into a trial database. But there's another avenue that I'd like to hear you comment on, which is EHR, the patient, and then back to the trial. And I think that's where some people have been talking about screening processes. Instead of us giving a list of eligible patients to a coordinator, why don't we just tell all the patients what trials they're eligible for and let them contact the trial machinery at institutions?
No, I think that, from my perspective, that's nirvana. The fact that we have to worry about what we can and cannot tell our patients about potential trials. We're just dealing with some of this stuff on Adaptable, with what we can and cannot share with a patient without going through IRB. And the complexities with that are greater than I think any of us ever would have anticipated. On a trial like Adaptable, that's 2 doses of aspirin that anybody in this room could walk out here and go get. The fact that we have to, we just were told by one of the CDRN networks on Adaptable that the patients have to re-sign their consents annually, even though the only thing that changed is the expiry date. We were like, so I went to Lisa Burdan and I'm like, we've got to solve that. Because if we can't solve that, working closely with IRBs and IRB chairs and the right people, then sort of all of this other stuff down the road will eventually just sort of dissipate, because people will get so frustrated with the upfront work that it'll become very, very difficult for them to want to continue to move things forward.
Deb?
Yeah, I feel that after, so now I guess 8.5 or so years on 2 different IRBs on campus, that it's that same culture clash that you had with the sponsor and with more traditional trials. The IRBs are very used to, you get a select number of people who meet very rigid criteria, who sign the 20 to 50 page, and then it's no matter what you do, it's okay. And I've always done outcomes and population research where that's exactly wrong, because it's completely, if you can't get data on the entire population, it's worthless. You're not trying to get the 5 out of 50,000 people for this one trial, and trying to get past how you need to ask permission to ask permission to ask permission, and things about anti-cold calling and not being able to do online type consents. All these barriers which are generally, a lot of my studies are like minimal risk. It's really is almost a cultural thing. I don't understand that you've negated the entire purpose of the research and you put all these same barriers. And I kept thinking, okay, I could drill a hole into a kid's head as long as somebody signed this 50-page, document. But if I'm trying to get population-based data, then it's crazy. Which I think goes with data governance. I think that's why that's the big flip, because if it's there but you can't get it, you can't move it around, you can't access it, it's, that's what makes it really, really difficult. And then we've done a lot of these, the VA is another nice example of, a set population that there are existing data sets that have a lot of people have worked on them, a lot of the variables have been validated, it's been linked back to EHR, It's been linked to Social Security, with Social Security numbers to Medicare data, so going through all that. But that's another big culture clash. People need to let go of these kind of theoretical, ethical, oh, this is so much better, but how is it better? Like John said, are we just doing it because that's how we've done it? I mean, it really doesn't work. It has to take a very different mindset.
Well, and I think it's also important to note that those kinds of barriers can differentially affect different patient populations and affects the generalizability of the findings from our work too, which is a serious consideration. We have a question from Dr. Hernandez in the back.
Yeah, so this is a great crowd here. I wasn't sure I was going to get a seat when I came in, so congratulations on really revamping the research forum and having this as a discussion and learning session. So actually, I have 3 questions, but John already started with one of them, which is, again, like thinking about how would you flip the model, because one of the themes that you guys talked about was governance. And so, like, it is hard to change a government or governance around these different issues, but if you go from the patient perspective, like, that can actually inform, could that inform actually collecting, donating, and sharing data, getting over the issues that Deborah was just talking about. And just as an example of that, John McMurray was just describing to us recently a study that they're starting in Scotland in hypertension, a comparative randomized trial for 2 beta blockers, and they had 20,000 people sign up for it overnight. And that was because they had a system that they could actually contact them. So just that kind of emphasizes, I think, John's point. But my 2 questions really are, as you've seen this landscape, you've seen the challenges, what are kind of 2 or 3 solutions here? Like what should be done going forward? And then the third thing is, you also talked about interacting with the informatics folks or the IT folks. Do clinicians have any role? Do they have any power in this? And what could they do?
So great comment. So I'll maybe take a stab at the first one, and others can fill in. So I think there's certainly an opportunity for reduction of the sort of general twitchiness around data linkage and concerns about security and privacy. All data linkage and secondary use of data has risks, and actually as part of another project that is funded by PCORI that Sean O'Brien is the PI for, we're working on characterizing those risks from the patient perspective and also seeing how mitigation of those risks might happen through using less sensitive identifiers as opposed to more, and asking patients specifically what they'd like to get back from the research in order to improve their comfort levels with use of data and linkage of different data sets. And what we found so far is that patients really want to know that their research has the potential to benefit patients with their health condition and patients maybe outside of that primary community. And I think we can do a much better job when we're thinking about developing study materials and study consent and very clearly outlining the risks and benefits, and also acknowledging that there are clear unanswered questions that could be addressed through linkage, and that it has real potential to improve patient care, and that part needs to be balanced with this general sense of concern and the issues that come up with respect to data security.
And I would say data standardization is definitely a solution. I think this is something I've come around to even in the last year, which is the idea of a CoreNet type model where there's a common data model that people are all putting their data into. It really forces people think about the EHR and they think it's data, it's easy, right? But the fact that there's a common data model in some way forces them to go find the information. We've had experiences in PCORNet where people say, oh, I know where that information is. And when they go look, it's either not there or it's incomplete. And we say, can you please go find your inpatient labs as well as your outpatient labs, or your inpatient kind of medication dispensing as well as your outpatient. And so I really do think if PCORNet or some sort of common data model like that can be shown to be a platform for this kind of work, I think more people will use it and it might self-sustain in some way. I just feel like so that's really about the technical piece. But I think there is this idea that data are easy, and I don't, as we get into this next year, I'm actually interested to see how these 10 sites actually do moving their data into this format because it's a lot more work than I think some of them anticipate. And there's always a place for doctors. No, I was just going to say, like in Adaptable, I think it's actually really interesting. We're going directly to patients and bypassing the physician. And I think one of the things we need to watch in Adaptable is how much that retention is or isn't affected by the lack of a relationship with a physician. It wouldn't.
There are other ways to get that. You can get the physician involved with the patient.
I mean, you have patients bring their physicians instead of physicians bring their patients.
I agree. But Adaptable isn't like that either. So yeah, sure.
I was just going to circle back around to what Emily said. Two things. One, that the only way that this path will become easier is if we share the dirty details of how we got to where we got to. And I think that, thinking about these lessons learned, thinking about sort of documenting the behind the scenes, not just the end sort of manuscript, will be important. And the other thing about sort of culture is that what I've seen in other countries, in the UK especially, is that there's this general community understanding that the data that is collected in these national data sets are used for purposes not only sort of for clinical care, but also for this greater good. And against that backdrop of that public good, it's much easier to sort of do this consenting for that with clear, sort of defined consent, simple consent. They've been able to access all sorts of linkages in the UK context, and I think that obviously that's a huge goal, a huge, lofty, potentially with a big shift that would have to change here. But I think that might be a worthy goal to sort of start disseminating out into not only our patients but sort of the greater society.
It's time.
We're over time. Thank you so much for your attention, and we'll see you next week for Precision Medicine.